Here with us today is Anthony Dickerson, JONDHI HARRELL, and Dr. Jordan HYATT. So give them a warm round of applause.
Okay, so I'm going to get us started here. I'm a quantitative researcher, so I approach this problem from a very different perspective. We try and measure things, we try and put numbers, we try and count, and we try to understand exactly what the magnitude or the effects of these issues are on people's lives. So community corrections, which here in Philadelphia is generally probation and parole, affects an enormous number of people. Nationwide, we're talking about millions of people, and it's a rate that's continued to grow, basically as the rates of incarceration have continued to grow. In more recent years, as we're looking at some elements of decarceration, use of community corrections actually increased significantly. And importantly, the kinds of people who are being sent to community correction, supervision by probation, is also changing significantly. The problem is, with probation, that most people think that it doesn't make a difference. And that's in the communities, and that's in the criminal justice system. And so what that means is, especially for serious offenders, they end up spending more time in jail. But the reality is there aren't enough beds, and people are being forced or being transferred into the community to finish out their terms of supervision. Skip that. So one of the kind of responses that the system has taken on is to increase the severity of supervision. So instead of, for example, coming in once a month to see your probation officer, certain people are coming in once a week. They're getting drug tested on a very regular basis. The police and probation come out to their homes. They interfere with their lives. And with the general goal of making a probation protocol that better approximates jail. The reality is, this started in the 1950s as a way to reduce offending. And what we found at that point was it didn't really make that much of a difference. However, as I said before, since the probation population is increasing, what ISP, or this intensive probation, became was a way to work to take more serious offenders, take them into the community, and supervise them, in some cases, right back into jail. So, despite having a pretty solid research base that increasing intensity of supervision doesn't really reduce offending, which is what its goal should be, it's still out there as kind of a political thing. We see it in the newspaper a lot, we see it in the media. People are returned to the community for committing serious crimes, and the system, the response is to do as much as they can, to watch them as closely as possible, to make sure that they don't step out of line, and as soon as they do, to put them right back into jail. So what we did, and I work in the Jerry Lee Center of Criminology, Penn's research department that focuses on these issues, was try and look at what the impact of these increased supervision protocols were on people's lives. So what we did is we worked with Philadelphia's probation department, and we ran an experiment. And for those who are interested in methodology, we randomly assigned a lot of people to either get more supervision or less supervision. And from a policy perspective, all these people coming under the supervision of the probation department would have been getting the most intensive supervision possible. What we did was we convinced the probation department to, for some of those people, supervise them less, so we could identify exactly what the impact of these programs were. So we had individuals, they were randomly assigned into one of three groups, and I'll talk about one of them later. They either got the most intensive probation possible, coming in once a week, drug tested once a week, home visits once a month, and really a zero-tolerance policy. So any mistakes, they were violated and they were sent right back to jail. We took some other of those same types of individuals, and they were supervised less strictly. They only came in once a month. They were only drug tested if there was a court order, and there was a significantly more lax policy towards minor violations like marijuana use. So this is what it looks like generally. Our treatment group was our more intense supervision, and our comparison group had our less intensive supervision. So from an experimental perspective, we did a couple checks just to make sure that our groups were the same, and this shows what the prior criminal history of the two groups were. There were really no meaningful differences. The same thing if you look at the offense that they were charged for at that exact time, what brought them onto supervision. So what this let us do is look at what happened in the 12 months after their supervision. So the way this research was set up is any differences between the two groups, it's not because the people were different, it's because of the way they were supervised on probation. So what we found is if you look at what happened to them when they came into probation on a regular basis, the intensive probation group got a much more intensive experience on probation. Field contacts are when officers come out to their house, phone conversations, how often they report it. These are all significant differences, and they're highly significant at the 0 level. So we're very sure that they had different experiences. So then what we looked at was, what does that mean? So what does it mean to come in more often? How does that impact the kinds of outcomes that we're able to measure? We're not able at this point to look at their attitudes or changes in the way they think, but we are able to look at arrests and absconding, jail, things like that. What we found is there's no difference. So this is how often people were, how many times somebody was arrested for each of these types of charges within 1 year. There's absolutely no difference. The same thing is true when you look at the percentages of individuals in each group who are arrested for all these kinds of offenses. When we do start to see differences, and this is where you really see the impact of these intensive programs, is in jail. So if you look at the number of people who were incarcerated back in the Philly jail system, if you look at the number of times they were incarcerated, and although it didn't reach significance, there was a pretty meaningful difference in the number of days that the intensive probation group spent in jail within that first year. And the same thing holds true with absconding. Being supervised more intensely, having more onerous requirements placed on you by the probation department, cause people to abscond, to stop reporting or run away, which results in a warrant, and if they ever do return to Philadelphia or if they're picked up for something else, it increases their exposure to additional jail time as well. So the takeaway from this, and this is kind of the main message, is if you take people who are equal and you supervise them more intensely, you interfere with their lives, you put bigger burdens on them, there's really no change in the amount of arrests that happen, and the amount of crime that's going on in the community that's attributed to these individuals. What we are seeing is an increase in jail and an increase in absconding. And these things both cost a lot from a resource perspective and from a community perspective. And these are driven not by the individuals, not by their histories, but just by their experience on probation. So you can see that there's a relationship between how people are supervised, how they're managed by the criminal justice system, and what their offending trajectories look like in the future. It's not just driven by who they are. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues to discuss their more subjective experience with community corrections.
TCRC is an organization that deals with persons who are transitioning. I like the fact that the sister earlier talked about reentry. Reentry is a word that we don't really use in any meaningful contact because reentry has really become a hustle, as you can see on the screen. We call this a system of accountability. Anthony, you want to talk about that?
One of the things that I noticed upon coming back to society was I tried to take my experiences that were inside and try to use that as a base to move forward. One thing that we developed on the inside, I befriended a few people, and we began to look at the system, and that's what really thrust me into doing a lot of legal research, was that I would observe what was taking place on the blocks. I was observing how the staff would interact. I would observe how they would just bring people back to jail for parole violations, for being 5 minutes late on curfew. So we went into a deep study of the system on our own. And we got good at it because that's all we did. One thing that we did was we developed a system of accountability. We use the term slipping. You commonly see it in prison where people just lose it. You know, one day they go in the cell, the next day they come out, the hair ain't combed, they got the shoes on the wrong feet, they done lost it. So that was so common that we made a pact that if you see me slipping or anything of that nature, pull my coat, get a hold of me. So when I came back out in society, I noticed that we didn't have anything like that. You know, we got so many programs in these communities, but the crime just continues. It keeps going up, and they go into jail younger and younger. So when I met John Dye, I met him at a meeting, Incarceration PA meeting, And we shared a lot of the same philosophies. And what we want to do is actually solve problems and not just affect a guy here, a guy there, because everybody can point to a success story. But what we want to do is have change on a mass level. And one of the first things we had to develop was trust so that we could begin to cooperate with each other, and then accountability.
And one of the things that we're trying to accomplish is creating a culture of how we think, how we act, how we interact. Returning citizens, the statistics say that there are over 200,000 of us in the city of Philadelphia, which means that is a huge base of possible support for us to help ourselves. So we talk about voter registration, political education, because with those kind of numbers, we should be controlling every city council seat in the city of Philadelphia. We should be electing the next mayor. We should be influencing the race for government. We should be running the city. In the city of Philadelphia, only 11% of people vote. Mayor Nutter won with 110,000 votes. There's over 200,000 of us. We're always asking for more programs, more this, more that. We need to be demanding this by the weight of our numbers. The only way to do this is to organize across the city. Anthony and I spend countless hours going across the city, meeting with other returning citizens who share our view, and there are many of us. We're going to create a cultural, a social, a political, a economic movement and help ourselves. Force politicians to create programs that actually benefit us. So many of the reentry programs are bastions of bureaucracy. If you go to City Hall, who's sitting at those seats? Sons of politicians, nephews, nieces of people. They aren't returning citizens. They were never on a cell block. They don't know what we went through. So why are they determining how our lives function? In order for us to effectively talk about ending violence in the city of Philadelphia, you have brothers all over the city who are respected in their neighborhoods. The kids call them OGs. They've done good bits, didn't snitch on nobody. Powerful, conscious brothers who are about what is right. Why aren't they being employed in their neighborhoods as mentors, counselors, peer support persons? They can lower the rate of violence in a single year. Dr. HYATT could document it, and we would all be saying what a fantastic thing this is. This is some of our wonderful staff that helps us. Give me a click. And that's basically some of the things that we are trying to do, and we'll speak more of. I think Dr. HYATT's going to give us more stats.
So the question really is, when you have all of this opportunity created by the more regular reporting and the more intensive probation experience, what do you do with it? We saw in the first part of the presentation that it's certainly not going to reduce crime. But so you have to look for something that can reduce crime. And one area that is a promising avenue of research is CBT. So basically, CBT is this psychological theory that suggests that the way you think about situations are influenced by a system of beliefs that you hold that are automatic, that are influenced by your life. And the way your beliefs and your thoughts line up influences how you act. And so it looks something like this. If you can influence the beliefs that people have about their own lives, about their agency, about their communities, and then the way that they interact with all of those things, in the long run, what we wanted to do was reduce offending, reduce crime. So there are a ton of evaluations of CBT and crime. I won't even suggest that you look at all that. The general takeaway is that CBT reduces offending. So this is the kind of example that you would see in the class that we set up, and I'll tell you a little bit about. But it sets up the kinds of relationships in people's minds that we think, or based on the research, reduce the propensity they have or the probability that they'll commit a crime in the future. So we set up a program in Philadelphia, and what it did was it's a 14-week class. It enrolled that other group of offenders that I talked about earlier, and the classes covered the same basic tenets of CBT that you see in lots of other things, but what we tried to do was working with both probationers, probation officers, and members of the judicial leadership was to come up with a program that reflected the experience of the people who were going through the program. So you see the basics of CBT, beliefs, cognition, and action. You can see classes that address anger and anger management, which we know are direct correlates of a lot of kinds of crime. And also, we talk about how you apply these new skills to the kinds of situations that probationers and people who are being supervised in their community face on a regular basis. So overall, we tried to get about 400 people, but unfortunately, a significant portion of these individuals were back in the Philadelphia County Jail or had absconded, as we saw earlier. So we got about 251 people into the class, and by the end, we graduated about 160 people. So it's a better graduation rate than you see in most other CBT programs, but we really think that in the long run, we can do better. So the numbers that I'll show you are kind of conservative. What we saw was that CBT, it didn't affect absconding, in the ways that we wanted to. So they were still under the same intensive reporting protocol that we saw earlier, so it didn't impact that part of their experience. It also didn't impact the offending frequency, the average number of charges. Where we did start to see a difference was in nonviolent offending. We saw a 7.5% reduction in our most conservative way of kind of counting this up. And if you think about what a lot of people were returned to prison for, it's things like burglary, retail theft, very minor trespassing, things like that. Under this high-risk protocol, that resulted in people's returns to prison. And it's certainly not the case that people in this study also didn't commit serious offenses. We had people who committed homicides and burglaries and things like that too. But this is a relatively low-cost, relatively non-invasive way of trying to change people's lives. It unfortunately didn't change incarceration in the ways that we would have liked to see, but again, these are relatively conservative measures. We did some statistical recalculations of this to account for the number of people who didn't make it into class, and some of these differences get a lot larger. For example, the decrease in nonviolent crime jumps up to 18%. And you think about the lives that people lead and the communities that they're in, we know that a lot of the people that we work with that are under the supervision of the probation department live in very defined neighborhoods within their community. So if you can decrease nonviolent crimes by 18%, in those communities, that's a meaningful difference, not only for the people who are in the program, but also for the people who are their neighbors and their friends and their families. We also saw reductions in drug tests. There was a reduction in both marijuana and PCP use. That's important. Marijuana is the most frequently used drug and results in a significant number of violations. And PCP is a problem that the probation department felt that if you had one positive PCP test, they were going to try and put you back in jail through the violations process. So reducing these also had meaningful impacts on people's lives. These are just the proportions of drug tests. I'll spare you all of that. What's interesting is, and unfortunately you may have a hard time seeing these lines, but what this shows you is that it changes the time to failure. So people who are in CBT go longer before they're arrested again. On the left is nonviolent charges, on the right is drug charges. They're pretty similar distributions, and what that suggests is that as we follow these people for longer amounts of time, we'll start to see more and more differences in the conduct between people who go into treatment and people who don't get treatment. So overall, the conclusions of this research project were that increasing probation intensity has no effect on offending, but increases returns to prison and other kinds of negative consequences for individuals in the community. If you can take that opportunity created by that more intensive probation protocol, you can deliver kinds of treatment programs that are non-invasive, not very expensive, that can start to have meaningful impacts on people's lives, which then translate to the ways that that their communities are being subject to very low-level crime, but also we would hope in the longer run to see reductions in violence as well. Jonda?
I did 18 years in the feds, came home in 2009. Anthony did 10 years in the state, came home in 2012. These are county figures, but the reality of our probation was basically the same. I was in a high-profile probation program where I had to call in every day, get a color for random drug testing. I was called down 2 or 3 times a month for random drug tests and just to check out what I was doing. It was very invasive, very intensive, and really had nothing to do with what I was going to do once I came home, because I'd already made up my mind what I was going to do early in my bid, and I had prepared myself for it. So what the probation departments are not really taking into account is the character and the nature of the individual person who is coming home. If you live in that cell for years and years and you miss your wife and your kids and your family, you miss the street, and you determine you're never going to eat commissary food again, you're never going to wear handcuffs again, you are never doing anything to sit in the back of a police car, and the only time you will ever be behind the bars again is if they invite you back to give a speech, then you are not going to reoffend. And these figures don't really mean anything. In terms of probation and halfway houses, I encountered a level of disrespect in the halfway house that was more intense than I had ever experienced during 18 years of incarceration. And this is the mentality of people who were tasked to help me transition. If you hate me, if you don't care about me, if you disrespect me, how can you have a job helping me transition back into society? I am transitioning in spite of you, in spite of everything that you do to incite me and send me back to prison.
One of the main things that bothered me the most upon release was parole fees, that they actually make us pay to have a parole officer supervisors. And I never got a clear answer as to why, because it was my understanding that the taxpayers pay the man's salary and his job description requires him to supervise me. Why am I paying him again? My parole fees, it took me 9 months to find a job when I came home. Matter of fact, he found me a job. No health insurance. Parole fees just keep increasing. It's crazy. I mean, how do you pay for something when you don't have a job? And when you do get a job, now you're in debt to your agent.
In addition to whatever assessments that you have to pay back to the court. I had to pay $35,000 when I got home. And every month, they wanted money. And if I didn't have that money, my probation officer was more concerned with me making that payment than actually what I was doing. It was crazy. In terms of what we try to teach to our men and women who come to the Center for Returning Citizens is things like critical thinking, ethics, social responsibility, parenting, criminal relapse prevention, many things that we haven't learned as young black men, women and men growing up. We have a peer support network so that when folks go through our classes, that becomes their family and they can support each other. Now your parole officer will tell you that you shouldn't have contact with other prisoners. Well, that's crazy. Who can help you better stay out of jail than the men who you walk the yard with? The men who are as determined to stay home and take care of their families as you are. Peer support is extremely important, and it's overlooked as a vehicle of how we move forward. One of the things that we are really concerned about is employment. We try to find people jobs, but we also are trying to create jobs. If you go all through North Philadelphia, you will see abandoned factories. Back in the days when we were young, for me it's back in the day, our fathers, our uncles, our aldermen in the neighborhood used to pack their lunch pails, or mom would pack their lunch pails, and they'd be off to the factories. Well, all those factories are now shuttered, they're abandoned, and there's no employment. We have a transitional house in Kensington, and I'm always trying to run the drug boys off the corner in front of our house. And they respect it when I come around, but as soon as I leave, they're back on the corner. How much better if I could say, listen, brother, you ain't got to do that. Come down to TCRC, I got a job, construction, $15 an hour with benefits. Come down here tomorrow, I'll put you to work. Until we begin to address the conditions that create mass incarceration, we are never truly going to deal with the reality. We have a lot of community support. We're both members of the Incarceration PA. Last year we walked from Love Park to Harrisburg. Now if you'd have told me 4 or 5 years ago, when I was in my cell, that I'd walk 110 miles to Harrisburg, I'd have said something that I can't say right now. And it ends with please. But we did that because last year, 23 schools were closed in Philadelphia, while hundreds of millions of dollars were allocated for Phoenix 1 and Phoenix 2. What does that tell us? That it is more important to house young black men and women than to educate them. These are our babies who are going to be going to Graterford, going to Camp Hill, going to wherever they deem to send them. Every school classroom that you close is 2, 3, 4, 5 people who are destined for the school to prison pipeline. This is a reality. This is not rhetoric. This is not stats. This is happening every day. And until we recognize this and begin to organize and actively fight against mass incarceration, this is going to keep on happening. A couple slides back, there was slides of the Coalition Against Mass Incarceration. Right here. This is a wonderful group of faith-based and grassroots organizations that operate out of the Unitarian Church up in Germantown. And we have come together to organize churches, grassroots organizations, universities, anybody who sees the reality of mass incarceration to come and join us, fundraise. Instead of organizations fighting over the scraps they want to hand us, organize and begin to move forward in a powerful way to raise money to fund the grassroots organizations that are doing the real work. When Anthony and I came home, we seen brothers who are out here 5, 10, 15 to 20 years working in the neighborhood and they can't get funded. Why can't the people who are doing the real work in this city get paid to do it?
That's true.
It doesn't make sense.
That doesn't make sense.
One of the, I know as far as with black men, they're under enormous pressure to produce. You know, when you constantly told you're inadequate, or you come out of jail, and if you were in jail before you went to jail, if you made money, you're under enormous pressure to produce, even from your own family sometimes. So it's important that we deal with the economic issues, because if you don't have, so many times people come into office and they got good intentions, but if they can't pay a simple bill, if they can't buy their kids a pair of sneakers, the conversation always goes back to going to do something illegal. You could just set your watch to it. So unless we deal with jobs, entrepreneurship, and dealing with the stigma associated with people who've been incarcerated, where they can move forward without all the baggage. In our little huddle, in regards to the previous speaker, when we were talking about mass incarcerations, our conclusion was gas chambers next. It's going to be all out war. If we don't create something alternative, I have a vision of an alternative economic system that's not going to stigmatize returning citizens, and that you need something where you could feel accepted. It just is good for morale. It's just good. It's just good for humanity in general. But if the architects of this system, they're making so much money, you're not going to talk them out of this.
And they're working full time, so part-time isn't going to do it. Most of our workers in TCRC are unpaid volunteers. We give them a small stipend and they move forward because they truly believe in it. When we find people jobs, it's because we want them to have jobs and we see the necessity. So we are trying to fundraise. We're going to be real. In order to fund what we're trying to do, it takes economics. So we're asking you to go on our website, donate resources, come together, go on the website of CAMI, come and join us. We have literacy programs for children of incarcerated parents. If you have the time to give to a child whose father or mother is incarcerated, come and see us. Sign up. We need you. That's the reality. mass incarceration has to be attacked on so many levels. Mass incarceration is not just people in prison. It's the entire structure, it's the system, it's the conditions that have been created and are being perpetuated. In order to attack this, we need to be working 24/7, just like they're working 24/7. They never close. We got to work just as hard as them in order to effectively move forward against mass incarceration. Now, questions? You have to speak up because I don't see any microphones.
I have a question in reference to the interchanging of probation and parole. They are not the same. And hearing the teacher here, he was speaking primarily about probation, and whereas y'all were talking about parole. And understanding that the two are different. A person that received a probation sentence never received incarceration. A person that received parole is a person who's been incarcerated. So there are two different qualifications for those folks. Right?
Yeah, so in Philadelphia County, they're treated the same, so they're supervised by the same agency under the same program.
One by the state, one by the city.
If you have a sentence of less than 2 years, you're supervised in Philadelphia County by the same agency. Right, you're right.
Not only are they treated the same, but to an employer, he often doesn't seem any different. Whether you've been in jail, whether you've been on probation, if that's on your record, he's going to throw your app in the trash can. So it's basically the same thing. It doesn't matter.
Now, when looking at people who are sentenced to probation, their situation is a little bit more dire and more immediate than a person who receives incarceration. And what do I mean? That if you are an individual that was working, that may have got a little misdemeanor case, and you went down there, you was working with a family, and you went down there to court, and you figured you was getting this over with, and you take this probationary sentence, you come home, go back to work, 2 days later, the employer is pulling you into the office, telling you that you're fired because we don't hire folks with criminal backgrounds. Next thing, he goes home and tells his family what just happened. 2 days later, probably, he get a phone call. It's the landlord. I don't rent to people that have been convicted. You have to vacate my premises. Now, this person that's on probation is now in a state of poverty and now facing a state of homelessness. Whereas a person who received an incarcerated sentence have X amount of time to get those things together versus where a person that get probation is somewhat faced with those immediate collateral consequences much more sooner. So I just wanted, by you speaking about probation and parole, they are different. And I just think that it should be made clear to folks that haven't had those kind of experiences like myself to understand that.
We do appreciate that, Brother Wayne, but these are merely graduations of despair. It's terrible on both ends. Yes, right here in the center.
I was just wondering if the research was available somewhere.
Yeah, the journal articles are under review, so I work here, so if you can look at my email, I'm happy to send you the working drafts.
John, hi, it's Broderick. I am very pleased to hear that you used the term returning citizens. Right? And we all need to use that and break the stigma of calling people ex-offenders. That's a statement. My question is to everyone here is great session this morning, but we're preaching to the choir. My question is, what are we doing to rehabilitate society and rehabilitate the businesses that are not hiring our returning citizens?
Does someone in the audience want to answer first? I see more hands there.
So this is actually something I learned about really recently. It's a citywide ordinance in Philadelphia that employers are not allowed to ask you about your record unless the job specifically has to have Social Security clearances. Full stop. They are not allowed to put the box on the application. It is illegal for them to have the box on the application. But we don't know how many employers are doing this. So if you go in, whether or not you have a record, if you go in and you find that an employer has put a box on their application and you're applying for a dishwashing job, they don't need to know what your record is for your dishwashing job, right? They put a box on that application, you can report it. Philadelphia Fight has a division called Institute for Community Justice, and like I said, I just learned about this program. I don't know all the details, but they have a way now where folks can report violations of this law, so that then we can go to the city council and say this law needs to be a public service announcement. There needs to be like stricter training of people who go to get business licenses in Philadelphia. But yes, it is illegal for an employer to ask you about your record in the city of Philadelphia unless you're doing something that requires security clearances.
I give much honor and respect to Philadelphia Fight. I love Hannah Zellman and all the folks over there. But let me tell you, ban the box, employers do what they want to do. What we find that works is we talk to employers and we give them the real. Listen, our folks have come home, they're hardworking, they're going to be there every day, they're going to be the best employer you ever had. Give one person a chance and you will see, you'll call me back and say, send me two or three more like that. We have to deal on an individual basis. If you know employers who will hire returning citizens, let us know. Let them know. It's a circle. Everything is who you know. It's that simple. People have to be given a chance.
I just have a quick question regarding is there any education that's being done with probation and parole? I know that your study just looked at the use of CBT, but the use of trauma-informed care, because I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have the unique perspective of seeing this from both sides. Both of my parents were incarcerated when I was an adolescent, and my son is currently incarcerated. And he recently absconded with the intensive supervision. And one of the things that he said to me, I pleaded with him not to abscond. And he said to me, Mom, I can't continue to be treated like I'm nothing. And to hear my son, I'm a clinical social worker, so I'm all about abiding by the law. You're on probation, you go to your probation officer. And he said, I'll never pee in a cup again for no man. And I think that in terms of the trauma that he's experienced, I've always requested for him to have a female probation officer because he has a horrible relationship with his father. The judge made a decision that the females weren't being hard enough and switched him to a male. And, I said to them, you have no idea what traumas people experience and how I believe the system re-traumatizes people with the way that they interact, the way they speak, from the person that you check in with, the voicemail of the probation officer. Don't leave any messages on this voicemail. If you had an appointment today, you should have been here. Well, if I don't have critical thinking skills. I have poor decision-making skills. I may have, not graduated from school, so I'm supposed to reason through what I'm supposed to do now. And, I think that trauma-informed care, I know that's a buzzword right now, but I've always treated people as though I use universal trauma because we've all experienced trauma. And I just really think that in terms of that would be an excellent study for you, Dr. Wright. For you to look at the use of education, I think, for the alleged mental health department of the probation department, no disrespect if someone works there. But I don't think that just because you label department mental health, that actually captures the essence, because every single one of those probation officers needs to be educated on trauma. Because if I spent a day in prison, I work in a prison and feel traumatized when I leave. Just the sound of the door clanging startles me every time I'm there. So to not have individuals educated on how you speak to a person, how you look at a person, who would want to keep going there? Yeah.
As a social worker, this morning in my class we were talking about cultural competence. Where's the cultural competence of probation officers in relation to their clients? Earlier on the screen, I saw Dr. Hyatt had a stat about probation officers conducting a class. What class was that? Remember?
So the class, the CBT class that we delivered was led by specially trained probation officers.
Specially trained?
Yes.
That's an oxymoron, right? What I'm saying is, these classes need to be led by social workers, counselors, psychologists, returning citizens who can identify and who truly care about their clients. If I'm in a class and my probation officer is conducting it,
I wanted to ask you a question. This past summer, they had a fair over at the municipal building, and they didn't realize how many people were going to respond, because a lot of people who have degrees and have the education, and they were looking for jobs. And then there was the group of people who are the returning citizens who are also looking for jobs. So the city of Philadelphia is overwhelmed by a number of individuals who are looking for employment, looking for their own job opportunities, and they ended up canceling it, and they had to reschedule it like 3 or 4 months later, and they put it over at the convention center because of the overwhelming response. So the city, the state, I think everyone needed to reevaluate who was really, putting forth the effort and trying to look for employment, and at least they're taking that search to the next level. But more people ended up coming than what they expected.
So see, a lot of that was smoke and mirrors. Those jobs fairs, very few people get jobs from the job fairs that are held like that. Those are just ways for the city to say, we care about returning citizens, look at what we're doing. Ask returning citizens who flooded the convention center how many of them really got jobs.
Really got a job?
There's a young lady holding up a sign here saying, please wrap up, I read very well. Listen, we really appreciate the time. Thank you for listening to us. We got table out front. Come to it. Thank you.
Thank you, JONDHI, Jordan, and Anthony. Also, I want to say that there are a lot of organizations at the resource fair who are talking about these exact same issues. So there's a lot of stuff about Ban the Box, ICJ is out there, TCRC. There are a lot of really great organizations. So really encourage you all to go out there during the lunch break, and yeah.